Welcome, members. Agenda tonight. Item 1, substitute. Sue?
No substitutes, Chair.
Okay.
We do have apologies, however, from Dr. Helen Vickers.
All right, thank you.
Will do, thank you. Okay, bye.
Item 2, members' interests. As I've said before, if you have them, declare them. I say it like that because I don't like to say pecuniary. I don't know quite, doesn't really fit with me. Admission of the public. I guess we're on YouTube still. Minutes of the meeting, 22nd of June. No, they're not. Have we all read them? I guess we have. Correct record. Matters arising. So could somebody say I second that?
I'll second that.
Thank you very much. And the proposer, say it.
I'll propose. I'm happy to propose, Chair.
Councillor Blagworth, thank you. All right, good. So, item 5. Do we need to promote Nick and Julia? Are you happy to stay for this, Julia? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Apologies. Yes, I am, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine. Well, more than welcome. And if anybody else wants to step in, Ben or Mark or... Well, I don't know who Leslie Boyer is.
Leslie's the head of school effectiveness in early years, and she's here for the item on the early years peer review. She's going to take you through the presentation.
All right, thank you. Oh, she can join as well if you want. Hello, Sarah. I managed it, huh?
Finally got here. I've been trying for a little bit.
Yeah, I had a bit of trouble getting on as well. No Northern Lights today. That's very disappointing. I was looking forward to what your background was going to be. When we've got Nick and Julia, let me know.
I'm here,
They're
Colin.
All right, got you both. Can you both hear me?
Yeah.
Just sort of check, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
indeed.
Right.
I guess you're very familiar with Zoom now. We all are.
Yeah, me
So-
and my children.
Yeah, well. How do you want to do this, Nick? Do you want to talk us through it?
Yeah, shall I kick off? Can everyone
Yeah.
hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. If you remember from last year, it's been a transitional year for us. So we used to have the safeguarding board that I was chair of. And then the government introduced a report called the Wood Report, and it was enacted in the Children and Social Work Act. And from last April, we've now become a partnership rather than a board. And that may sound bureaucratic, but it does make quite a difference. So we used to have big meetings with 30, 40 people in, and now we have a leadership executive of the 3 key partners. Julie Jenkins is one, Penny Woodhead from the clinical care group, and a senior police officer. That's changed recently due to maternity leave. So Julia services all that partnership. And my role is now similar to yours, actually, called a scrutineer. So where we're up to at the moment is we've produced a 12-month report, which you've seen. Used to be called an annual report in the old system. And my role now, I didn't write that report. My role is to respond to that report. And I'm going to do it by the end of August, which is when my period of office comes to a close. So I think you've all seen that report. As you know, safeguarding is very demanding, so we're never complacent, but the services are good in Calderdale. I'm convinced of that. That's my scrutiny role. In particular, you've got a very effective multi-agency training system, and a very good, something I was interested in, closing the loop on serious case reviews, because they can be written and then no one acts on them. But you do have a very active system led by Julia of checking out what's happened as a result of the serious case reviews. And I attended a meeting about a very difficult serious case review to do with child sex exploitation, and it was very impressive that Well, a lot of the staff was still there, which may sound a rather simple point, but I think really matters. You know, they had the longevity and the loyalty to stay within Calderdale, and they remembered the case and they could explain to us what had changed as a result. So our current challenges are, we're still doing this transition phase, and perhaps Julie Jenkins could speak later about when I leave. It's obviously not my role, so that's still in play. There's a lot of challenges through the internet, which you'll be aware of, children being groomed, etc., and we're working on that. And in particular, we're prioritising the transition from childhood to adulthood, and that can be a little bit disjointed. Sometimes it's a national problem, not a Calderdale problem. We're really trying to prioritise that issue. So we're working very closely with the Adult Safeguarding Board and with Adult Services to make sure that young people get a seamless service from being legally child to legally an adult. So I can assure you that the services in Calderdale are very effective, that the multi-agency working is good, that children are kept safe. But of course, we have these new emerging challenges. Obvious one at the moment is COVID, and you may want to ask questions on that later on. Julia, is that a fair summary of where we're at?
It is, yeah. I think the only thing that I'd add is to just heed warning that it is still in draft form. It's unlikely to change drastically at all, but just to let you know that it's due to be signed off in the next few weeks. And the other thing, it's quite a detailed report. And as Nick said, this provides a kind of independent scrutiny of the safeguarding arrangements and looks at data and audit and lots of other things. And serious case reviews is one of the elements that Nick's described of how we actually look at what services do in Calderdale to safeguard children. I think if we can take questions, Chair, we're happy to, I think.
Okay, members, I would say before we kick off, our members are thinking, I read the report, I thought it was comprehensive is how I would describe it. And I share your optimism. I think we've been through a few of these, and I have one or two questions, but I'll let members go first. Now, the way to do this, members, is you can wave at me, but sometimes my screen freezes up. So if you want to ask a question, best if you go through the chat function so that we know. And if you're all going to be shy and wait, I'll go first. Oh, Colin.
Thank you, Chair. In the report, it refers to 2 audits that it says are due to be reported about now. And as you've already alluded to, a lot of problems arise at the interfaces between services. So one of the audits is of the transition between children's and adult services. And the other audit that's been referred to is children whose parents are suffering from mental health problems. So they have the interface between adult and young people's services. I was wondering when those audits are likely to be produced and when we might be able to see them.
Yeah,
Julia's probably in the best position on that, Julia.
Yeah, that's fine. Different answers for each audit. The parental mental health audit is yet to be reported on, and that's been a delay due to COVID, and actually getting the multi-agency partners together to be able to write that report. So that has been delayed. The first audit that you mentioned, though, with regards to transition, we've, as Nick has highlighted, taken that a step further and identified it as a key area of focus for the partnership. So there's actually a lot more work than just an audit going on around transition. I in Calderdale have highlighted it to my colleagues across West Yorkshire and across Yorkshire and Humber, and they have all agreed that actually it's a priority for them as well. I service the Safeguarding Adults Board as well as the Children's Partnership, and it is a priority for both of those, which makes sense. And we're doing on transition what's called a holistic report. So that's not just an audit, that will be everything that we know around transition. So that will be looking at any data we can find, feedback from children, adults, service users, feedback from their families, feedback from the frontline practitioners, and audit activity. And from that more holistic picture, we'll be reporting quite a hefty kind of assurance document about what's working well and what areas needed to improve in Calderdale.
Chair, can I just ask that when those do become available, that we can add them into the work programme for this board?
Absolutely.
Are you happy, Colin?
Yeah, yes, it's work in progress. It'll be good to see what recommendations the audit comes up with and a plan of how those might be implemented.
Okay, good. Howard?
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the opportunity to thank Nick for all his hard work over the period of time. I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity for Nick to extend your chairmanship given the current situation. So that's one of the questions, because we really value your input and knowledge and experience, of course. The second part, and it's a really comprehensive report, so thank you for that equally. But what I think is slightly missing, I may have missed it, so if you can point me in the right direction, and this is about the awareness of drugs in young people, and the safeguarding measures in place for surrounding drugs, because I may well have missed it, but I can't seem to find it in the report.
Nick, do you want to say that first? Or?
Yes, could you go first, Julia, and I'll pick up the point, obviously, about my position, yeah.
Yeah, no, we obviously within safeguarding, there is a lot to look at, and the safeguarding covers a lot. The drug and alcohol team within public health lead on the issues around and tackling drug and alcohol issues within young people and adults, actually, obviously. And for the Children's Safeguarding Partnership, what we would be looking at is what is the service responses to those children, young people in need. So if it became apparent, if we had evidence, if we had data or something telling us that we needed to look at the services responses to young people who take drugs, then that's when the partnership would be involved. Does that make sense? Rather than us just focusing on it because there are already people, you know.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Actually, I realise it's an extremely wide remit, but I didn't want to be missing something if we needed to pick something up. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Just on my position, I mean, it's probably for Julie to comment rather, but my contract ends on the last day of August. That's 3 years, which seems to have gone very quickly. Due to this new system, you can actually have a process rather than a person. So, for example, you could appoint a university or a consultancy to do the scrutiny work, and people like Julie, Penny, Sarah Baker, when she's back from maternity leave, could chair the meeting. So that's an ongoing discussion at the moment, but certainly I wouldn't leave you in the lurch if it wasn't possible through COVID or whatever. But we've got an executive meeting in July, so I think we're going to discuss that issue then. Thank you.
Care to comment, Julie, or not?
Yeah, we have been looking at options in the partnership about how we could do the independent scrutiny a bit more broadly, and whether we could use some of the regional peer review and peer challenge mechanisms as well to review each other. And we have been talking about the chairing role and whether we could share that between us on a statutory basis between the three partners, as Nick said, but we haven't made any decisions yet. And I do welcome Councillor Blackborough's words of thanks, and you know what you've said about Nick's contribution as well. We usually take a chair on for a 3-year period and then recruit a new chair to give us independence. But as Nick says, the new guidance from the government working together allows us to do independent scrutiny in a completely different way. And Julia's worked at quite a few options of how we could do that. We could get a university, and as Nick says, we could focus a lot more on the audits, as Councillor Hutchinson has raised today. Do you want to come in, Julia, and just say what some of those options are?
Yeah, I can do. Or actually, we've got what's called an independent scrutiny and assurance framework. So if any of you were, struggling to get to sleep, I can send you that, and that kind of details all of the different ways that we will continue to do this following Nick's departure. So I can provide anybody with more details, I think, if anybody wants that.
That's comprehensively answered. Amanda.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, congratulations on a really extensive report. I've always been really moved by how deep that Calderdale actually does this, does safeguarding. I work across different settings in various places around the country, and I'm faced with some people who know safeguarding, who do safeguarding really well, and others where they could actually be improved. So I'm really impressed by your extensive, I suppose really like how well you do it. You're doing it really well. Could you just explain to us how you deal with issues that are across boundaries? So, if a child is in another area, is that information that is easy to share, and how you work together? That's my first question. And then the second one is more around how are we supporting young people, let's say, who are on inappropriate platforms. I was in a training recently where I was a little bit surprised to see what was actually really going on. And I was just wondering what we're doing in Calderdale. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Should I pick this one up, Nick?
Yeah, I'll start, and then perhaps okay. Julia or Julie could pick it up. In terms of the partnerships, we do have, thank you for the kind words. We do have very established regional networks. So I chair, it happened to be just on Friday, a meeting of all the Yorkshire and Humberside people in my role and in Julia's role. We had about 20 there on Friday in a similar platform as this. So we know that we're, singing off the same hymn sheet, if you want to use that phrase. So that works very effectively. There's also a national network, which is still emerging due to the changes that we've said. And Julia in particular is very active in that as well. So I always like to know that we're not out of step, that we're not behind the times or whatever. Those two forums give that assurance. We do have across West Yorkshire shared procedures. So we know that Bradford, Wakefield, etc. are literally using the same rules as we are. So that really enhances cross-region development. And it would be Julie Jenkins' staff who did the more practical work. If there was a child who ended up in Brighton or Bristol, whatever, then the frontline social workers would link with the social workers in those areas. But again, I've been satisfied. Julia, if I put her on the spot, you might describe the work we're currently doing with Manchester and Bradford on the cases that we've been concerned with as an example of the issue that the councillor raised.
Yeah, I can do. I think just to echo you first, Nicola, that the actual, depending on what kind of state of your child protection, looked after child, if it's about child exploitation, there are lots of different procedures that are written specifically for situations. What we add to is we write the procedures for that, but we add to by using guidance. So where there are no procedures, where the child might be in early intervention or not on a statutory kind of footing, then we provide guidance, encouraging staff, and indeed we've had serious case reviews in the past highlighting that cross-border issues need to be recognised, and we've done a lot of work to try and overcome that. Obviously we don't seek assurance from other authorities that they do the same, but we try and do it within Calderdale. Nick's talking about, there's a serious case review in Manchester that's currently going on with a child that was placed in Calderdale. and that will be published soon. And similarly, a rapid review process from Bradford, which involved 5 authorities. So there's a lot of regional work happening, and we try where possible to encourage that more, so to reduce duplication. So there's people like me who are not sat in every local, every authority trying to do the same thing. Yeah. Did you want to do, I mean, social media you touched on as well. So Nick mentioned that that few of our priorities transition. Online safety is another one where we'll be taking this holistic approach and this holistic look at online safety. It won't be easy. Where you've got something like child exploitation, we know what the issue is, we know what we're trying to resolve, we know what it is. With online safety, obviously, it's such a breadth of cybercrime, grooming, bullying, self-harm. So it's, there's such a breadth that actually knowing what the issue is a problem, is a task in itself in this holistic reporting. But that's what we're focusing on now, Amanda.
Thank you, Julia. I was actually referring to, I don't really know how to describe this apart from platforms where, young people are being watched, I was just at, I saw a program on it, and it's basically, they link it to the bank account, and they're just literally like, walking around their room, and they're getting paid to do this. And, there's, I don't know what the police are doing. I don't, I mean, I was just quite surprised that this is still going on. And are you aware of the sort of platforms I'm talking about? I'm not talking about Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. I'm talking about stuff that's like a little bit more to the edge than that.
No, but just as I said, we're going to try really hard to find out exactly what those issues are, such as that I didn't, such as those things. There's a lot more, and actually finding out what the problems, what the issues are, what it is that we need to tackle is a task in itself. Yeah, so that's what we're just starting to work on now.
Okay, thank you.
I just follow up on that, something I should have mentioned. Before last year's meeting, you may recall that we had an event involving young people, and we were awarded national funding for that and got some very high profile national recognition. And one thing that we learned is about listening to young people, because on all those issues they are ahead of us. So they were sharing with us their concerns, and there were platforms at the time I'd never heard of, but obviously they're more in the picture than we are. So it's really important, particularly on that issue, to have those strong links with young people. It's been held up a bit by COVID inevitably, but we were having regular face-to-face meetings with young people until COVID struck.
Okay, I'm happy.
So sorry, second.
Helen.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wonder if I could just add a little bit about the COVID-19 challenges, and looking at those identifying slides. You particularly talked about the gap for disadvantaged children being wider than ever, and I think that's something we're going to come back to again tonight. We'll also refer to reduction in early years provision, with many providers possibly going out of business. And early years is one of the important ways where we try and actually address the disadvantage with which a lot of young people start. By the way, I should have also said I wanted to congratulate you on the excellent practice in safeguarding. I was involved in doing a review on domestic violence, which Amanda was also involved in, and the excellent practice stood out. So sorry, I should have started by saying that. But perhaps I want to say how we're going to meet some of these challenges, because more disadvantaged, probably fewer providers to try and do, to get the foundations in place to minimise that, more pressure on services. You've not mentioned domestic abuse, and I know the evidence that might be contested, but a lot of countries have suggested that's become worse with COVID-19. So perhaps we'll just ask about how some of those key challenges will be addressed.
Thank you. It's probably a good idea for me to start, and Julia's got some very detailed material on this. We've had 2 assurance meetings with Julie Jenkins and colleagues, And we've gone through each service asking what the challenges are. And there are challenges, but actually, again, I was very, very reassured. And we looked at all the statistics as domestic abuse, for example, and they're all within the normal range. You know, 1 week they might be up a little, 1 week down a little. But the police, we explicitly asked the police, were they still offering that protective service? And they are. And we've been through health and social care, and we were very reassured. Now, there are challenges around the corner, and the next meeting will focus on those. For example, when schools are open completely, there may be more safeguarding referrals. There'll be a backlog of care proceedings in the courts. So at the next meeting, we're going to go through that, you know, the implications of COVID. But so far, those 2 meetings have been very reassuring. Julia and I were discussing it earlier, actually. But Julia's done some leading work, and this has been nationally recognised on the issue you raised about the early years. So over to you, Julia.
Yeah, following on from the meetings, we pulled together some assurance documents and tried to really look at a risk register, I suppose, of all the different areas of services, what had to change due to COVID, due to lockdown, actually, what services had to change, and whether the children were still safeguarded, you know, in spite of these changes. And we were assured in almost all, you know, counts, and schools in particular have really stepped up for those. We know who those children are who are on child protection plans, children looked after, children in need. Somebody has sight of those children and we know who they are. The children that fell underneath that, schools were doing a fantastic job, if they were over 5 and attending school, of keeping in touch with those very vulnerable children. Where we potentially identified a gap is exactly what you've just said, is that earlier settings were closing and nobody was seeing the under 5s and nobody had sight of them, and those under 5s who were not on a child protection plan, child in need, are looked after. So we've done a piece of work basically pulling together intelligence from across a partnership, from health colleagues, children's centres, family support, early years. A lot of work's gone into reducing duplication, seeing who out of those children are being regularly contacted anyway. And then the children's centres and health visitors have been instrumental in then going out and visiting, making contact with these families, welfare checks. And it's been really positive because actually the children now are receiving activity packs from children's centres. There's regular support for parents and for those families. So I'm just in the middle of writing a report about that to the senior leaders. But it has been a really positive piece of work so far, you know, and as Nick says, it has been picked up nationally, and some people are wanting to look at some research on it as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can perhaps just say this is something I would suggest we need to keep on our radar as a scrutiny panel, because it is obviously the key challenge as we move forward. Thank you.
Good point, Helen. Sarah.
Hello. Yeah, thanks again to everyone for the hard work put into this very comprehensive report. Now, it may be that I've missed it, but I just wanted to check that, or to ask, are you monitoring the information that you've got in terms of so different sort of minority groups? And if there's any patterns or impact, are you keeping a check on that, and then sort of targeting groups? So are we finding that there are, say, children who are identifying as LGBT are maybe more vulnerable or less vulnerable? You know, have you got that sort of information, as well as looking at different ethnic groups or other sort of communities that you can sort of identify within the borough? And just sort of making sure that if there are any patterns emerging, that we can sort of really be even more proactive in those. Thank you.
Okay. That relates to the previous points I made about communicating with young people. So at one of the big open events we had for young people, we did record all the information that you've just spoken about, and actually it was disproportionately, as I remember, a good representation from lesbian and gay community and from young Asian men as well. So we were very pleased about that. So we do monitor all that data. Again, Julia is better at the monitoring detail than I am. So over to Julia.
Yeah, there's been a few. There's been a serious case review in the past on child sexual exploitation, and from that we changed our data reporting to include ethnicities of victims and perpetrators. And we are still now not seeing the number of ethnic minority young people coming through on those matrices. There are more, but I think we all recognise that that's not fully representative. We are working, I am working with the Association of Safeguarding Partners, and we have a webinar in 3 weeks' time to look at how we address this. So yes is the answer. We do collect some information. Are we doing enough, and actually are we scrutinising it? There's probably more that we as a partnership who scrutinise the services, and possibly more that services that can do, but I don't have the answers yet, I think is the answer to that. I think nationally this has become apparent that we all need to look at ourselves and how we are dealing with the many issues that are arising. So really we're starting to work on it nationally to see what we can do.
And I guess that's why, sort of I want to bring it up as a question, because then it sort of keeps it on the agenda. So it's not a criticism, it's more just about making sure that is kept on the agenda. So thank you very much, that's great.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you, Chair. I really don't have much appreciation of how much the justice system is involved in the safeguarding process. We know that there was very large backlogs in the courts even before coronavirus struck, and those backlogs have got an awful lot worse. Can you foresee any practical impact that would have in the safeguarding of young people over the coming months?
Thank you for that. If I could start, Julia may have some points. We have a strong link with the youth justice team that Julie is the head of ultimately, and they're represented at our meeting. So there's the issue there of young perpetrators, which we unfortunately get. And there's also the issue, obviously, of adult perpetrators. The court system can be slower, as we all know, and sometimes I think we do get a bit frustrated about the delay. For example, we're often waiting to publish serious case reviews until the legal process has taken place. But again, that'll be on the agenda for our next meeting where we're looking forward. Julia might have something to add.
Yeah, just in Calderdale, the Youth Offending Team Service has undertaken assessments of risk, safety, wellbeing against all current cases. Contact has continued and been based on that risk assessment. It still continues with one-to-one telephone or apps or things like this, and also visits at home they've undertaken as well using social distancing. There's been a lot of support actually to young people from that team, and the youth workers have worked jointly with the police and community wardens anyway to help young people who might have been out in groups during this period of time. They are hosting virtual drop-ins and have a full digital offer. There's quite a lot that the people in the Youth Justice Service Youth Offending Team in Calderdale are doing. But I've just seen a headline nationally that says, that's said about young people and the delays. They may well be adults by the time it gets to court, which obviously will impact on their outcomes.
Julie.
Yeah, just to make an additional comment, I think Councillor Hutchinson was asking about court delays in respect to care proceedings, and you're completely right in the fact that the capacity of the courts is seriously reduced. But we have had quite a few recent communications from the Judiciary Service saying what they're trying to do to find additional space to have socially distanced hearings. We are still doing some hearings over the phone, but we know there is drift and delay for some children. We're not getting final adoption orders being made, and we're not getting discharge of care orders. They're not seen to be priority. So we have raised this with the Judiciary, and they are doing what they can, as we all are, to kind of gear back up to, you know, working within COVID with socially distanced courts and increasing the capacity and increasing the bases where they can hold court hearings as well as doing virtual hearings. So everybody's acutely aware of it, and it does come into the youth offending arena as well, as you know, as Julia's just touched on, that cohort of young people. When lockdown happened, they weren't dealing with young people in the courts, but they're moving towards the socially distanced way of managing all of that safely and dealing with more cases coming through. But it is something, you're right to raise, Councillor Hutchinson. We are keeping, you know, a very close eye on that with the, you know, with our colleagues in a Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service to try and get things moving faster and delay and deal with some of the backlog.
Good luck with those efforts.
Thank you.
Did you wish to add something, Nick?
No,
So,
no.
oh, okay, fine. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now. Page 7, Child Death Overview Panel. Long-time members of this panel will know where I'm going with this. Modifiable factors continue to be associated with more child deaths in Calderdale. Consanguinity, or as you would prefer to call it, autosomal recessive disorders. This comes up every single year. I think the last time I remember the numbers, we had 6 children who died because of this, modifiable disorders. And although you're saying that Calderdale and Kirklees have now genetic counselling, and I realise it's a very tough subject to get your head around in terms of, especially in the current climate. But we're talking about equality across the board. What are we actually doing about it? And what is your board recommending that should be done? I'll just remind you, young people, babies, are dying here in Calderdale today.
Yeah, so can I just touch on the more modifiable factors? Nationally, there's a difference in how every CDOP reports, and this has been a real problem, and they're trying to tackle it from the Department of Health. So we class a consanguineous relationship and the first baby as a modifiable factor, whereas in other Bradford, for instance, do not class it as modifiable unless one baby in the family has already died and they have had genetic counselling and then a second baby dies. So there are differences in the way that each CDOT reports, and that's due to the lack of clarity around the guidance on it. So that's just the first point to make. And the second point to make is it's a very difficult subject, Colin, and families are being counselled having genetic counselling, and there are kind of some campaigns that have been sent out by Public Health. I don't know whether Ben wants to come in here, but it remains as difficult as people stopping smoking at the moment of how to tackle this.
Ben, are you in a position to comment on this?
Yeah, I thought I might get pulled into this one. So we've had a discussion about this before, and I think the conversation is the same, really. There are things we are doing, and we're trying to do that on a West Yorkshire basis, and we're trying to use the evidence through research to support our approach and do something consistently across West Yorkshire. And that's taking place through the Health and Care Partnership, the West Yorkshire Health and Care Partnership, and we're doing that because, as Julia says, this is not an easy thing to talk about, to do anything about, but we do think it's easier to do that at scale across West Yorkshire and have consistency in practice than do something specifically in Calderdale. Now, I would have liked to have come to you and said things have moved forward on this, and they were moving forward. We've been a bit busy in public health, so a lot of the things we were doing have paused whilst we're dealing with the COVID. So that work, I know, is in train, but hasn't necessarily been implemented yet because all of the processes around governance and all that kind of thing have kind of paused whilst we've been doing the work on COVID-19. I think the assurance I can give Scrutiny is that this is really important to us as well. and it's really important we do what we can to address the genetic conditions generally in a consistent way across West Yorkshire. And so there is a plan in place. I can commit to coming back to you once that work restarts, once we're perhaps not quite as busy with the COVID work, if that's okay with you, Chair.
Yeah, that's fine, Ben. I guess you'd be expecting that question anyway. I realise it's a very difficult subject to handle. Again, I'll go back, especially in the light of recent events. If you look at the disproportionate death rate of people in the payment community for COVID-19, and this is front page news, and nobody's thinking about, I don't want to upset anybody saying this is that, blah, blah, blah. It's absolutely plastered all over the place. I've had a government inquiry, and yet you look at the child death figures for Calderdale, or I suspect even nationally, and I'm betting you already know the answer to this. BAME children are much more likely to die, and yet I don't understand why there's not a national outrage about it, even from the BMA community itself. Anyway,
I think we have to respect different cultures, think in different ways, and so we've had this discussion before. What you may consider to be, I suppose, a cultural norm might be very different from other residents of Calderdale and their cultural norms, and so there's a bit tied in with that, I think. And I think
I understand the reasons behind it, Ben, and I'm not unsympathetic. What I think was needed is, I hate to say the word more education, but the science behind this should be made, genetic counselling should be made almost compulsory for everybody. I don't care what you're doing, or you can predict, these things are predictable. We can print a genome off a bloody 3D printer in 10 minutes. Why can't we educate everybody to these problems? I find it, we should be offering genetic tests as a matter of course. It should be like going to get your teeth checked. Another thing I'm obviously pretty keen on. All right, we'll leave that there, Ben. I've got one more question, and you're not going to like this either, I don't think. Page 19, underweight and very obese children safeguarding pathway. It's only a red concern. There's only a sort of advice if you're underweight to ring the maths team, whereas there's no red ring the maths team if you're extremely overweight.
Yeah,
which is more harmful?
No, if a baby or child is considered that they're failing to thrive, that they're not reaching developmental milestones because of the weight, because they're failing to thrive, then that should be looked at as a safeguarding concern. There may be health issues around that, and the multi-agency screening team will be having a look at that. If a child is overweight, it's not necessarily a safeguarding concern. So that's why the red box, if you like, Colin, is further down, is if actually, you can engage with families. There may be health reasons around this. And you can engage with families and actually steady that weight so it doesn't increase. Then it's not a safeguarding concern at all. So it only becomes a safeguarding concern if then the family chooses not to engage, and the child is then at a level, and health colleagues can probably talk about this much better than I can. But yeah, is at such a weight, overweight, that they are actually impairing their development skills. So yeah, so that's why the difference is, Colin.
All right, thank you. Sarah, take as long as you like.
It's really just a quick one. It was just a sort of comment about the sort of higher level of deaths of child mortality in the BAME communities, and I think that, you know, my thought on that would be that I would imagine that it's not just issues around the really long co-sanguineous things, but also, I mean, there's other issues around disadvantage that families who are BAME have that can increase child mortality. So I think if you're looking at it as a national picture, just picking up that one issue is probably not the only thing, really. I'm not saying that it's not potentially an issue. Obviously there are issues around that, and I agree, but I just think that overall, looking at a higher infant mortality in BAME communities, there are going to be a whole host of reasons for that, around increased poverty and increased poverty. You know, I think it's sort of well documented that there's you know, more poverty and disadvantage amongst BAME communities that will also lead to worse health and worse outcomes for children in those communities. That's the sort of wanted to comment, really.
Could I come back on that, Colin? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. The numbers of child deaths in Calderdale is so low that actually having learning from the deaths is really, really difficult. So what you're saying is potentially correct. And actually, we might also be thinking that children who live in poverty, it's actually just living in poverty, may have more chance but our numbers in Calderdale are so low. You know, some years we have 11 and 16 deaths. You know, they're so low that actually trying to produce learning from that is really difficult, which is why it's so important that, as I've said, this national reporting is done correctly and is done so that we can compare apples and apples across the country, and we can have some learning that comes out of this. As well as know for our local population what our needs are. So it just a word of caution there that you're probably possibly right, Sarah, but you know, it is so low, the numbers, that it's very difficult to statistically draw conclusions from that.
Chair, could I just refer people to a website called Born in Bradford, which covers all the issues we've just been talking about, actually, obesity, consanguinity, etc. And they've tracked every child born in Bradford, obviously different from Calderdale, but we can learn from it. I think for the last 8 years now they're up to. So, for example, one thing I remember from that, there's an association between obesity and how many fast food outlets there are in a locality. So you can track all these issues. It's called Born in Bradford. It's worth spending half an hour on a lot of the issues we've just covered.
Yeah, a few years ago we had Bradford come and talk to us about this very subject. I think this board made a recommendation to the council that planning permission shouldn't be allowed near schools for fast food takeaways. I take on board what Sarah's saying, but the issues of deprivation around child death are, well, modifiable, if you like. Those are things you can address on a national basis by making society fairer and all the rest of that. But the consanguinity, that is not affected by environmental factors. That's not part of the argument there. It's a genetic thing. Just is. It's not. You can't change it by throwing money at it. You can only change it by education and explaining to people what's actually happening. There is no doubt that it's a very complex subject, but that particular cause of child death is a fact, I'm afraid. Nothing to do with, we've had the discussion about how many people are dying in COVID and the relative forms of deprivation. People in divided areas are 50% more likely to die than people in wealthy areas. And that is probably true, but that's not a factor in this case, because it's a genetic disorder. All right. Have I got anybody else? Julie, did you say? Oh, Colin, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. I don't want to downplay the issue of cousin marriages, but if you consider the large number of first cousin marriages that take place, the number of autosomal recessive, severe autosomal recessive disease leading to child death is actually quite low. I mean, if it was a practice that consistently led to early death, that practice wouldn't have survived. So it is, you're quite right. It's something that with time should be possible to modify, one would hope, and we should try and make every effort to. But far more essentially normal children are born to first cousin marriages than severely ill children. So I just want, it depends on which side, which direction you look at this from.
Yeah, I take that on board, absolutely, Colin, absolutely. But you can have a genetic test that will tell you what your likelihood is. It's clear. I like the Darwinist twist to that as well. Is there anything else, members, on this?
Yes, from me.
Oh, sorry, Julia.
It's okay. I would be strung up if I didn't mention that it's Safeguarding Week this week. And today the focus is on adverse childhood experiences and transition from childhood to adulthood. If you watch one thing on transition, please watch the Des Holmes presentation that she did in Calderdale on transition from childhood to adulthood and safeguarding in transition. But look on our website. I can send the link out to Lauren, or if she can send that around, that'd be fabulous. But please do take part. There's a different theme each day. It was domestic abuse yesterday. Yeah, transition and adverse childhood experiences today. I'm just trying to find the others. But yeah, please do take part. Thursday, online safety scams and exploitation. And then Friday, promoting resilience and emotional health and well-being.
Thanks very much, Julia. Lauren, send us all a link, will you? Nod or something, Lauren.
Yeah, she nodded.
All right, good. My screen is rubbish. I'd like to add my thanks to Nick for his service to Calderdale. It's been very much appreciated. I've enjoyed the 3 years talking to him. Julia, as ever, fantastic report.
Thank you.
Okay, can we move on, members?
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Everybody's gone. Let me know, Lauren, when everybody's here.
I think you've got everyone, Councillor Raystrick. We've got Julie Jenkins, Ben Lehman, Mark Randall and Leslie Boyer for the next couple of items. So ready when you are.
Well, we're ready. Item 6, COVID-19 briefing. Children and Young People Services. Director.
Thank you very much, Councillor Raystrick. I'm going to start by giving you the update this evening on the children's social care overview. Mark is here to give you the update on schools and the wider opening. And it'd be good if Ben could join us as well and just bring you up to date, particularly around test and trace and what would happen if we needed to deal with an outbreak in a school. I think it'd be really helpful for you to be cited on some of those issues as well. I'll start with social care. And just to let you know that things are very stable in respect of staffing. Sickness levels in the council are the lowest they've been for a long time, but the initial social workers who went off who were unwell or shielding, people are back at work, obviously working from home, but a stable workforce, which is good. We have seen demand increasing at the front door. As you know, at the beginning, it really did slow down with all children being at home with their parents. It has been increasing slowly. Some weeks are busier than others, and domestic violence is at the same level that it was this time last year. And that was just touched on earlier for yourselves that, we are seeing reports coming through in the police and the support services for people suffering domestic violence, are operating in a socially distanced way. Julia Caldwell's just let you know about the visiting plans we put in place for the vulnerable children. And I've got to say the working between social care and the schools has been absolutely, it's been exemplary. It's been, it's hand in glove. It's fantastic and something we really want to build on more for the future. But the visiting, because we're monitoring it to all of the vulnerable children, is now actually higher and at more of a rate than we saw before lockdown. So we have standards that we adhere to. We've got visiting frequencies, but we're actually seeing children more than we ever have done before. We have started face-to-face contact for children with their families in a socially distanced way. We've opened our contact centre. It's deep cleaned when families come in and when families leave, but we are still doing some of it remotely. And actually some of the parents and the children, particularly if you've got a long way to travel and there's a lot of contact happening, are quite happy to have some of that, not virtual, but exactly as we're doing now over a video call, but face-to-face is happening as well. Residential is stable, I'm pleased to say. Lots of support going into our foster carers. And Mark will give you the data around how many vulnerable children are now in school, because that's increased significantly. I've touched on the backlogs of court already that with Councillor Hutchinson's question. Just like to tell you that we're finally from social care, we're trying to look with asset management of ways of trying to get that sense of team and the pods back in a socially distanced and supportive way. It couldn't happen very often. It'd have to be done in a very safe way. But if you think about a newly qualified social worker who's just come into post, going out, you know, onto the patch, visiting families and not coming back to your team, not really, for some of our newly qualified staff, they've barely seen the team. And that's very, very strange when you're used to working in that environment. So we've got to be very much mindful of safe working practices, which we are. But just to let you know, we are exploring ways of how can we do that in a socially distanced way. I'll just pause there, Councillor Raystrick, in case anybody has any questions for myself on the social care side, and then Mark can move on to schools.
Stephen.
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. I actually did a Reg 41 visit today to North and East, and one thing that they stressed was, you know, that the pods must come back as soon as possible, when it's right to do so, because they do miss that just talking afterwards, after they've dealt with a difficult case, and that's having a sort of adverse effect on the staff as well. So I just wanted to make that, emphasise that fact. But I agree with you, you know, from the feedback from them, what you've said is absolutely correct, Julie, as usual. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to hear it from you. I'm really pleased you've managed to do that. I take it was in a virtual remote way with you touching base, but they'll really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Councillor Baines.
Anything else, members? I have a question. I read an article in, I won't tell you which newspaper, yesterday. The number of children removed from their families and taken into care has shot up by nearly half during lockdown. Numbers requiring foster homes rose by 44%. And the number of people inquiring to be foster parents fell by 50%. It's a statement from Barnardo's. Are we seeing any of that?
No, not at all. We've seen a slight reduction in the numbers of children in care. David Chambers, who you've seen before at Scrutiny with some of his social workers, has reported things are starting to really pick up in respect of the number of case conferences that will be happening and the numbers of, we call it pre-proceedings, the public law outline cases that are coming through. So we are starting to see that rise, which we knew when lockdown started to lift and children were returning to school, that we would be seeing, the levels of neglect and things that had maybe been hidden. But no, I've got to say there was something about the kind of Calderdale approach, particularly to lockdown, as I explained to you, about foster care is really sticking with it. Not having breakdown, we've had no foster care breakdowns. We haven't placed any children external to the borough. And it was really a huge effort, I think, to keep children safe and keep them supported in the community. And it's just given us that really close partnership working with schools. I really want to continue after this. And I told you about the pilot that we've put in for the government, whether we could have some social workers wrap around schools in the future and really test that out and develop it even further. But we haven't seen that, Councillor Raystrick, and I do think it's to do with our approach and assuring ourselves and you and people like Professor Frost with our eyes on the vulnerable children particularly, of making sure we know how they are and how they're living and what's it like behind those closed doors. So no, we haven't, but I just think that's to do with, you know, the responsive nature of the support and the service.
That's excellent. I like it. Right, I mean, to death did that report. Anything else for Julie members? Okay, do you want to move on? Is it Mark?
Should we do Mark next? Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Councillor Oistrich. Obviously, scrutiny members will be aware from my email that I think you may have received on Monday morning that things are moving very quickly and we're working in an ever-changing context. The most up-to-date information is even more positive than some of the data I shared at the weekend. And it's really pleasing to tell you that our overall attendance in primary and secondary schools, including our special schools, as of yesterday was 17%. On Friday, it was 11.6%. The national average was 11.7%. So I'm sure there's been an increase in the national picture. Whether it's been an additional 6%, I don't know, but that's definitely been the position in Calderdale. One of the things we have seen, linking to, I think, Councillor Riveron's point earlier about early years, was we're seeing around 45% of our reception children back in school and around 40% of our year one children. That's really positive for us in Calderdale as a result of, you know, lots of the discussion that we've had, and I know you will have and we will have as the meeting goes on. Our youngest children need to be back and need to be settled, and that's a very positive picture. It's what we've encouraged schools to do, and thankfully, yeah, that's really paying dividends. In terms of our vulnerable children, we're currently at 40% of our children with a social worker, so child in need, child protection, or children looked after who are back in school, and around 25% of our children with an education, health or care plan. We don't have any national averages around those two figures. However, just picking up from some communication with regional local authorities yesterday and today, our 40% is by far the highest. The next information I'm receiving is around 29 to 30% in some local authorities. So a positive picture in terms of overall attendance, vulnerable children's attendance, and then those children with an EHCP. We've got 11 of our primary schools that are unable to open any more widely. And by that, I mean they are open to key workers and vulnerable children, but as a result of their robust risk assessments and the space that's available in the school, staffing profiles in school, then they're not able to open any more widely. Although some of those schools do have around 50 or 60 children in. And again, if we look at small schools, some of our smaller Victorian buildings, actually given the government's guidance of bubbles of 15 or less, and then given the fact that some classrooms in some of our primaries in Calderdale can only house 8, then we're very much assured that those schools are doing their very best. And albeit they have welcomed back more children, we do have to acknowledge that there will be some children who they're not able to welcome back safely at this point. In relation then to some of the government recent announcements, I think I'd put in the email, and obviously members will be aware that £1 million catch-up funding was announced by Gavin Williamson, Secretary of State, last week. 650 million will go to be directly delegated to schools, and then 350 million will go to the national tuition programme. And Gavin Williamson advises and hopes that schools will use some of their catch-up funding in order to access that national tuition programme. Obviously, that money will be delegated to schools directly from September. And what we will then begin to do through our school effectiveness team and through our cluster models is just begin to understand how schools are using that. For a pupil premium funding, then schools have to report on that, and it's picked up and evaluated by Ofsted. We're not aware as yet that Ofsted will take any view on it, but there will be some accountability in terms of how schools use that to support not just disadvantaged children, but children who have clearly fallen behind. So I think that's something that we can continue to do through the School Effectiveness Challenge and Support Offer, but also through our cluster funding as well. Because as we've alluded to this evening already and on a number of other occasions, then nationally we are aware that there is likely to be a gap or a widening of that gap. So that catch-up funding will play a part in it. One of the things we are already doing and will continue to do through our cluster model is encourage any funding that we've given to clusters to be used even more so to support disadvantaged learners. Schools Forum agreed to delegate around 350,000 to clusters. They've done that for the last few years. I chair the School Improvement Cluster Partnership Board. And again, clusters already use that funds to support school improvement, but also to improve outcomes for the most vulnerable learners. So that conversation will most definitely continue. Just in terms of some of our most vulnerable children in our alternative provision, government have also earmarked an amount of money, only a small amount of money, for every year 11 who attends alternative provision. And I've already been in discussion with Phil Hannah, who's the head teacher at the Whitley AP Academy, and Phil's got plans to identify a member of staff in the autumn term who will continue to connect with those year 11 children in order to support them into the next stages of their education, and very much working with C&K Careers who work with our post-16 children in terms of reducing the numbers who are not in education, employment or training, because that's going to be a key. You know, obviously many companies that would have first, a number of months ago been operating are now not going to be operating. So apprenticeships are going to be less, so that the role that Phil can play with those year 11 with that funding, and the work we can continue to do with C&K Careers to ensure that as many of our young people leave year 11 and remain in education, employment or training is going to be very much key for us as we move forward. In terms of the curriculum models and in terms of some of the challenges schools feel they will face, we've talked a lot about recovery curriculum. Many children will have been at home for the last 6 months, may have suffered loss, grief, lack of routine, lack of stability, etc. So schools are very much working on what we're calling, and actually it's a national project around a recovery curriculum, and very much focusing on relationships, recognition, regulation, routine and reflection. Because if we can't get those basics right initially, then actually children's learning academically won't move on at the pace it needs to do. Interestingly and anecdotally, speaking to some head teachers over the last few days, their children have come back, they've been resilient, they've bounced back to learning, and they've just wanted to get on with reading, writing and maths as well, which I think is really important to recognise, because those children won't have had that diet of the basic skills that they are very much used to. So I think that's some challenges still remain. We mentioned early years earlier, and early years funding. We continue to lobby the Department for Education in relation to early years funding. As of last Monday, 113 of our providers were open out of 318. It was an increase from 79 during lockdown, but we've still got a significant number of providers who are not yet open. Part of that will be because schools haven't yet returned to normal, and obviously then the uptake of the demand from parents hasn't been there. But we're very much continuing to work with DfE in relation to ensuring that funding for early years providers is provided and it meets their needs, because we are pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, our sufficiency and our proportion of settings and opportunities for 2 and 3 year olds was above that national picture. We want to continue that, because obviously we're all aware, as we've already discussed, that early years plays such a vital part in young children's development and education. So I'll pause there. It's given you a whistle-stop tour of the worlds of school and education. So if anybody has any questions, then feel free.
Thank you, Mark. I've got questions queuing up, but I would say before, I greatly appreciated the update you sent me over the weekend. Thank you for that. Stephen.
Thanks, Colin. Mark, thanks for the figures earlier on the attendance of early years. But have you got the same figures for years 10 and 12?
I haven't got it in that way, Councillor Baines, because year 10 and year 12 are being welcomed back up to a quarter at a time, so we're not able to gather any average. One of the things I am able to say, though, is looking down our individual schools on a daily basis, there are around 50 year 10s and per school, and around the same from year 12s. So again, we don't have it in any average, because obviously our children in primary attend day in, day out, whereas our secondary attendance is a little bit different, because some children will be in for 1 or 2 days, some children will be in for further days. But it's very positive. I've just picked up that, you know, Michael Gosling at Trinity and Sowerby Bridge are saying it's around 60% of their year 10s in. Obviously, that's not continuously, but it's around 60% of the cohort that they will meet the needs of and be able to welcome back.
Yeah, are all secondary schools actually providing a provision for years 10 and 12
yes.
purely because of the exams next year? So all secondary schools are doing it?
Yes, they are. All secondaries are open. One secondary began with year 12 last week and has opened to year 10 this week, but and that was one of our grammar schools. All of the other schools are welcoming back. I think the appetite and desire and ambition from our secondaries is to welcome back as many as they can do, because secondary schools realise that for these young children, this is their only chance. They will be taking GCSEs next year. So the more they can do, and the sooner they can do that, the better. And that very much is the ambition and the view of our secondaries.
Thank you.
Helen.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask some particular questions related to this disadvantage gap, but particularly around IT access. And you did mention in the update that we got that 300 laptops arrival was imminent. I don't know if they've actually arrived, but perhaps we could have an update on that. But I would also perhaps like to ask some more general questions. I know we might, the academies will be ordered separately, but I wondered if we did have any information from academies about any IT that was ordered and the IT gap. Now, like Councillor Restrick, I was also reading a newspaper article over the weekend. One particularly struck me was the difference between the private sector. A particular example is Manchester Grammar School, where they have managed to deliver a full curriculum through Microsoft Teams since lockdown, and nobody missed out on a lesson. The comparison with the state sector might be around a third at most, not because people are not working extremely hard and doing everything they can, but because you have to have a multi-pronged approach to try and ensure access for people who've got limited or no IT access. Now, so we can only see that disadvantage graph is getting wider when those who have the unfortunate position of not losing out on any of the curriculum, and those who are perhaps getting a third or less. Now, I know some of the talk is about going back to normal in September. There's also suggestion that it will be more like blended learning, and I would have thought that's a distinct possibility. I know it is in colleges. But we've also, goodness knows, we hope there won't be a second wave, but surely we would need to prepare for that. And part of the preparation of that should be around blended learning and IT access to make sure those who have suffered disadvantage so far don't fall either further and further behind. So, I mean, obviously these laptops are very welcome, but the other question was, do we have an idea of the level of demand that would actually need to give everybody this access? I mean, I know also we can to college, not schools, but in preparation for September, one of the things that we're surveying and asking is finding out about a student's IT access to see if a blended learning provision is going to give the access we want. So we need to know who's got access to computers, and I'm sure a lot of schools will have that information. And also, are there any other sources available to try and provide tablets or some way that we can try and make sure that people do have equal access to the curriculum, and this disadvantage gap doesn't go any further?
Just in answer to that, Councillor Ruffron, then, as I identified, I think in my email, just to give more clarity, we ordered 231 laptops for children with social workers, 35 laptops for children in year 10 at Todmorden High and Calder High as their RLA maintained. So academies ordered a similar number for their year 10s and then 41 tablets. In terms of need, then we were initially allocated around 600 laptops or remote devices in Calderdale, but we very carefully talked to schools, asked them to do exactly as you've said, survey the children, talk about which children needed the device, and then the same with our social workers. And in fact, we arrived at, well, just short of 300. So we've done what we can do in terms of working with schools to identify the children who need it, to identify those children who would benefit more from that approach. And again, I was assured, talking to some secondary schools in particular, very much at the start of lockdown, that actually schools had lent their own equipment to those children who need it. So schools are in the best position and absolutely have supported. And I think it's fair to say that we're sitting here tonight concerned about the disadvantage gaps. Head teachers are far more concerned and are the ones who have already undertook a number of actions to support that and will work with us and continue to support that. Interestingly, in terms of September, I think your point is valid. Obviously, we don't know what the indications are for September in terms of arrangements for health and safety, for bubbles, for optimum numbers. Boris Johnson does keep saying he wants to welcome all children back. However, I've picked up today that there's been a significant amount of additional funding given to the National Oak Academy, and the Oak Academy has been providing online learning opportunities since after Easter. So it does make you think that welcoming all children back might not be all children full time continuously, and there still may be a need. We still do have obviously we've got about 300 left, so we will continue to work with schools and we continue to ask them to identify where there's a need, and then we can follow that up with DFE and order those additional devices as needed.
So we will have the option of ordering additional devices if we need them.
That's my understanding. However, I'm hoping, well, I'm not hoping, I'm confident we might not, because schools have already undertaken a robust survey of their children, and actually it's schools who've identified, and social workers who know the children and families better than we do in terms of ensuring that we've got the devices for those children who do need them. But we do have that potential if we need it.
Okay, thank you.
Leslie had a comment. Leslie?
Yes, just to follow up on some of those points that Mark's raised there. In terms of the £1 billion catch-up fund, that's for school-age children, and we're going to look at the early years strategy, but it's at the moment there's no funding identified for that catch-up programme for early years, and I think that's something that locally we're looking carefully at how we can support that. One of the approaches we're taking in Calderdale is that the School Effectiveness Service usually provides a level of challenge to those schools that are causing concern, and within that there's allocations of officer time. We're looking very carefully this year at how we risk assess schools, because clearly there's no data going to be available for us to use, and also all schools are vulnerable now because of the impact that they're seeing for their own cohorts and their own context. So we're going to be working differently and developing much more of a robust universal approach for support for schools through the Primary Development Programme. And we're working with our teaching school alliances, the English and Maths Hub and the Music Hub, and with our cluster officers to make sure that we've got a really comprehensive offer there for all schools. We're bidding for some funding through the Partnership Board so that schools can have free access to that. We don't want to create any potential barriers there for schools. And there'll be a number of items there that will be generic, so certainly work on closing the gap. We recognise it's nationally recognised, and certainly we've been doing work pre-COVID on making sure that we address that issue in Calderdale. And so there'll be a significant amount of work with those partners in making sure that we can support schools in closing that gap and use the catch-up funding to the very best impact that's possible. We'll also be looking at curriculum development. Mark touched on the recovery curriculum. That's one aspect of the work, and that's come from some work of some academics that we've been promoting within Calderdale. And in fact, we've got an event next Tuesday that's being provided free of charge to all Calderdale schools to attend that and learn more about how the recovery curriculum can form part of the school's curriculum going forward, because that's a long-term piece of work. It's not a quick fix thing in the first few weeks of school. The other thing that we're looking at closely through that programme is around business continuity, and I think that fits with some of the comments that have just been made about what things might look like in September and the potential for some localised outbreaks or some potentially a second wave, or looking further ahead at in future years of other issues that may arise with similar infections. And so we're hoping to do some work through that primary programme on looking at how we can learn lessons from this period. We can, particularly about business continuity for schools, but particularly education continuity. So Councillor River, on the point you were making there about blended learning going forward, so we can learn what's worked well and where there have been some pitfalls and how we can plan to avoid those in future and make sure that schools are well supported. So there's a raft of work going on there. There's also work going on post-16, because we're very mindful obviously that there'll be fewer opportunities, particularly as Mark said, through apprenticeship routes. So we usually have an event in October planning ahead for students. So it would be for the students planning for next summer now, but looking at wider opportunities and involving more stakeholders and developing work with a whole raft of people who can be supporting our post-16 opportunities there. So there's some work going on, and there's some Leeds Beckett University and the Employment Hub are working closely with us to develop some opportunities for that. And then just finally an update, Mark mentioned about the numbers of early years settings that were open as of last Monday. I've had a brief update today. We haven't got the exact numbers, but it looks now as though we've got over 200 settings that are open. We potentially are going to have 22 that we know of at the moment that won't open at least until September, and we are waiting to see some of those potentially won't be reopening at all. The financial issues have been significant, and I'll come on to that in the next item.
Thank you, Leslie. Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that, Mark. It was really useful to read that report. You were saying that 11 primaries can't open any more widely due to space restriction. So the bubbles of 15 are more like sort of 8 because of the size of our buildings and practicals. Julie, do you remember last time we were here and you were going to have a chat with the heads? I was wondering how you got on with that, about talking about public spaces, public buildings, libraries. We've got sports halls, we've got museums, we've got amazing spaces that we could use a little bit more effectively. I was wondering what the head teachers' thoughts were on that.
Yes, they're very mindful, particularly the couple of schools who haven't got the space to open more widely. And indeed, one of them had kind of looked at the local, it was either a community hall or a church hall that they wanted to use to expand their space. Unfortunately, there is some guidance from the government about wider opening that is very clear, saying schools are not allowed to spend any more money than they already do. They're not allowed to recruit any more teachers to meet that need, and indeed they're not allowed to use village halls and other places due to health and safety concerns, I think, around insurance, around the safe social distancing, around the use of the space. Clearly we're ambitious for children to be back, as many children, my view is we want as many children, in fact all children, to have some education in a setting from September. And Mark and I have a meeting with the head teachers tomorrow where we'll be talking to them about this. Clearly, logistically, for some schools, it's going to be extremely difficult. And I did have a meeting with the local MPs for Calderdale, with Robin Tuddenham, the Chief Executive, last week, or it might have been earlier this week, you lose track of the days. So I have spoken to both of the MPs, to Craig Whitaker and Holly Lynch MPs, about this very issue, Councillor Parsons-Hulse. And that is going to be taken up back with central government. because if we've got a very old Victorian school, as you know, as we discussed last time, it's just not going to be possible, and we cannot have a cohort of children because of space can't come back now or in September. So we are onto it. We're doing what we can. It's just a few lines within the government guidance, and you can see it's probably been made for good, you know, for what the government feel is a good reason. But just for the odd setting, we really do need to think a bit more widely about what other buildings is it safe to use, which we are doing so. So to let you know, we have, and I did raise your point with them, and we did talk about Denmark as well and what they were doing with museums and football pitches. So we have had that discussion with them.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Sylvia. Sylvia?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, the question I had, which I think's pretty much been answered by inference by Mark, which was about the laptops. So I take it the ones that are being delivered now are the ones that were the promised by the government some time ago to provide laptops for children who needed them. Is that right? That it's those finally coming through?
That's right, Councillor Dacre. It's been an extremely elongated process. I think we initially got notification of the actual announcement of the project around March time. They're only just being delivered, and that's not just in Calderdale. In fact, our tablets or iPads will be delivered as of next week. I think I had a conversation yesterday with DFE who asked, could we replace tablets with iPads? So it's very much government-led in terms of the elongated process.
Yeah, okay. And then I had two comments really. Firstly, we all seem to have been reading a lot of newspapers, and I'm a bit worried that we're all relying on what the newspapers are telling us, because you can't always trust them. But what I'd been reading was a teacher down south somewhere who had spent hours preparing a risk assessment for the return of children to school, had been frantically contacting the government, trying to get some help on this, and in the end had to do it all herself. And my immediate thought was, why? Where were the local authority? Why wasn't she talking to them? Why weren't they talking to her? And what it really made me realise was that I think that Calderdale are to be commended for the very proactive approach they've taken, that you've been, because as I understand it, you've prepared guidance for a risk assessment for schools to use. You can't do it for them, but you can give them the guidance, which she obviously didn't even have that. And you've been supporting and collaborating with all the schools, local authority controlled and academies, which again I think is really important. You haven't just said, oh well, the academies are on their own, they can get on with it. And I think that's been really impressive and really worthwhile for all of our children. But really the other thing I wanted to say in connection with that was that I know the Public Health Director herself isn't here, but I was rather unhappy to see that the Todmorden News described her second guidance as a U-turn, because first of all she produced the guidance saying that 3 of the 5 tests weren't met, and then she produced some more guidance saying that she now felt that they were either met or likely to be met, and that was described as a U-turn, and I felt that that was very unfair, because as far as I could see, she was simply adopting a consistent approach and analysing changing data, and that is not a U-turn. It's a change to new data, and I just wanted to put on record that particular point. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. I used to be very keen on people buying newspapers. I'm not so keen anymore. Sheila. Oh, sorry, Sheila. Also, that's the first time I've heard the Todmorden News quoted. Thank you very much. I don't get that down my end of the valley. Sheila.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to ask a question because, again, reading the press and things like this, there seems to be a number of schools throughout the country who, having opened wider, are having to either shut down class bubbles and people go into isolation because there's been cases of COVID. Have we had any of that in our schools or classes or the bubbles or whatever they're called these days? And if not, have we got something in place to deal with that? And of course, then with the news that schools are going to open even wider again, would that system still be effective, or would we have to think again?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Shall I ask Ben if he wants to answer that? Because we've worked very closely with Ben and continue to do in relation to public health advice and guidance.
Yeah, more than happy to come in there, Mark. Yes, we are seeing cases within Calderdale residents and within children who are attending school in Calderdale. That's to be expected. If you read the media, you may think that COVID-19 has gone away. It hasn't, but it's still around and about in the community. And so we will see either children with symptoms or children who get positive tests, and that there's nothing out of the ordinary about that. Every other area will be seeing the same. I'd just like to highlight we've taken a more precautious approach, I suppose, in Calderdale, in saying that if schools are seeing children with symptoms, we're suggesting that they should close their bubbles down whilst they await the test result. And the reason we're doing that is just really is, at this stage, we're not sure of the impact of wider opening, and we want to ensure as best we can we're keeping the children, young people safe, the staff who work in the schools and the early years settings safe, and their families too. So we've gone a bit further than the national guidance on that to support schools. That will be reviewed as we go forward and as we know a bit more about the impact of opening up or widening the opening of schools. But I think there's some inevitability that we'll still see cases coming along. What I would say is and Mark said the same really, we've got a really good relationships with our schools in Calderdale. And when I speak to my colleagues, I think we're in an excellent position in Calderdale compared to some of the other areas where they work. So schools ring me on a regular basis to talk through anything that's going on in their school, whether it's a child with symptoms, whether it's a sibling or a parent, or whether it's a confirmed case. And we support them with their response to that on an individual basis. And that's a 24/7 service. So they ring me at the weekends, they ring me in the evenings, that's fine. And that's part of my role as I see it. And so I think, I suppose to answer your question, we will see cases. I think we've got a really good system for responding to support schools to keep children and their families and the teachers safe.
Yeah, thank you. So have we had bubbles closed down, for example, within Calderdale schools?
We have, yes. Yeah. We have had that happen. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I see that as schools are working with us to ensure they're doing the right thing, and they've responded really well to that. So I think it's a good thing that that's happening actually.
So I just want to say I'm very pleased to see that the system is working and that we are looking out for our children and young children and their families. So thank you for that.
Colin.
My apologies. I missed a few minutes of Mark's presentation, so tell me to shut up if I'm asking something that's already been covered, and I'll watch the YouTube replay. But I just wondered, a number of areas in the country, there's been funding put in for school activities over the summer holidays. Calderdale isn't an area that's had specific funding, but are there any moves to make use of school facilities over the summer holidays to try and have children in as good a shape as possible before the autumn term begins? And my other question was about, there's been announcements of funding for primary education and secondary education, but I'm not aware that there's been any suggestion of funding for further education. And obviously that's quite an important part of the futures of many young people in Calderdale. Are there any plans for trying to reduce the impact of the dislocation that's occurred in young people in further education?
Just to pick up on that, Councillor Hutchinson, you're right. Calderdale haven't been identified as one of the authorities to receive additional funding for summer activities. Our schools will be continuing with holiday schemes, with summer activities as they would usually have done. And the guidance we believe from government will be that schools can continue with those activities as opposed to remaining open as they have done since the beginning of lockdown. We will be working closely with colleagues in leisure services because obviously, you know, year on year, there's a full range of activities. I don't know what degree, to what degree they'll continue because, you know, a lot of those are swimming, for example, but, you know, colleagues are continuing to look at that. I think we just need to be mindful when we talk about summer schools because in some respects, you know, the feel also nationally from heads and from parents is that teachers, staff need a break and children need a break as well. And in some respects, and this again is a personal view, but sometimes summer schools can actually lead to a widening of the gap because inadvertently the children who attend summer schools aren't necessarily the ones who need to attend. So that there's something there, again, just a personal view there, but just to consider. But again, what we will be doing is we'll be continuing with summer activities as planned, but unfortunately, we've not received any of the additional funding. I think locally to us, it's Sheffield, Leeds and Bradford. Even though there are areas of deprivation in Calderdale where some of those children would still benefit from even sports activities, even re-socialisation, taking turns, playing together and just socialising, which they've missed. So we are hopeful that that will continue. And then just in relation to your question about post-16 and further education, again, no specific guidance, but we do continue to work closely with Calderdale College in terms of their approaches and with a number of activities planned in, you know, in the autumn term to ensure that the majority, to ensure that our proportion of children who remain in education and employment or training continues. That is very positive in Calderdale. We're in the top quintile for the proportion of our children in education, employment or training, and we want that to remain even with the challenges that are faced. So work will continue to ensure that remains as positive as it is at the minute.
I think you're right, Mark, about summer schools. Like everything else, it's about targeting, isn't it? Howard.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Mark, thank you very much for the comprehensive report. It's looking quite positive as though we're getting back to business as normal. Equally, welcome the additional money to help young people. I'm keen to have some mechanisms so that we can ensure that this money is spent in the right direction. Just two questions. One is in relation to the virtual school as to what's the virtual school doing to ensure that actually we're going to help those young people in care catch up as well if they need additional support. The other one relates to what's the position in relation to supply teachers in schools. I'm not quite sure whether they're using their existing staff of other years to actually cover the lessons or whether supply teachers are still on board. I'm not quite sure on that. If you can just clarify that, that would be a great help.
I'll answer that first, Councillor Blackburn. That will vary from school to school. We duly outlined earlier that we've received some additional guidance in relation to expenditure and schools aren't able to spend additional money on staff in terms of managing the welcoming back and the wider opening. But some schools will have supply teachers who work regularly with them, who continue to work with them. But again, schools aren't able to spend money to secure additional supply teachers to open more widely. So it'll just be in schools where they currently use that. The question about virtual school is a really important one. Our virtual school made the decision very early on in lockdown to fund remote devices for all of our children looked after who didn't already have one. So they're not included in the wider tranche because the virtual school, out of their funding, Pupil Premium Plus, made that decision and funded those children. So I think from a remote device point of view, that's enabled those children to still access their school's own resources, to access the Oak National Academy, and also then to keep in touch with their virtual school coordinator. There's been a number of Zoom type meetings to bring the children together. because I think one of the things we've already talked about in many ways is children not seeing the friends and not seeing other children. So I think that's a big part of it. So luckily, all of our children looked after as part of the virtual school have had a device, and that has helped them in their learning. Just in terms of the catch-up style funding, then we have every child looked after is allocated through government an amount of money. I think it's around £2,100. Don't quote me on that because I don't know the exact figure. But what happens is every term, when schools complete what we call their personal education plan, then Rosina Kelly, as our virtual school head teacher, releases £700 to the school per term. Now, obviously, because children have been in school, some haven't been in school, the whole notion of those children having a fully functioning personal education plan is slightly different, because things will look different. But what we have committed to doing is that every child looked after their school will receive their full allocation of £700 for the summer term, whether they've been in school or not. Because actually what that will then enable schools to do in the autumn term is provide additional resource to ensure that those children are supported as effectively as they can be. That £700, it's kept by the local authority, but then schools claim it from the local authority. Some schools never claim it because they don't feel that they need that additional funding, and they feel that they're able to support those children, out of their own resource. But we've been very clear that all schools will receive that additional funding, whether they want it or not, interestingly, which hopefully will be positive. But it's most definitely going to be to try and address some of the issues and some of the gaps that will have begun to be evident over the last few months.
All right, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, members. Nobody else waiting, so we're going to move on to item 7. I guess if we're going to stay with the same audience. How are we doing this?
I think I'm going to. Do you want me to feed through the report, the presentation, Julie?
Yeah, Councillor Raystrick, people, you know as members that we've had the review, LGA peer review of early years arrangements in Calderdale. And what you really wanted to focus on tonight was the action plan in relation to the recommendations. So Leslie's done you a PowerPoint, which I think you've got with your papers.
Correct.
So if Leslie can take you through the key points. Leslie's convened and chairing the group as head of early years, working to Mark, has convened the group that's working on it, but we're also in discussion about putting something more in terms of governance arrangements, having it report up to myself and Deb Harkins as the senior leads, which it says in the presentation too. But I'll hand you over to Leslie now.
Leslie, before you start, but a few words of advice. We've all read the report. What we need is explanation rather than it being read out again.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to introduce myself, I'm Leslie Boyer. I'm the Senior School Effectiveness Officer. And as Julie said, I also lead on early years. And we started the peer challenge. We started discussions about that some time ago with the LGA. It came about after we'd done some work in the authority to identify some gaps, particularly around disadvantaged children and those with special needs at the end of early years. And we carried out a Wicked Issues forum with a whole range of services that helped us realise that the gaps for children are started and well formed before they start school. And we recognised that there was a need for an early years strategy that started pre-birth. So this work had started ahead of the peer challenge. But then we worked with the LGA to arrange this challenge that took place in February. The team were in for a week. They'd done a lot of work beforehand, and it identified many strengths. I think you've had sight of the report itself. Strengths, but also confirmed the areas that the Mind the Gap work we'd been doing had already identified. The report was published around the time that the crisis was developing, and so the work that's followed on from the since that peer review has continued, but also there's been some impact on all the services that were engaged in that work, because obviously we're working with health, public health, schools and early years settings that have had a number of other priorities thrown at them as well. So just to touch on the impact of COVID, because that certainly has a bearing on the work that's going on. And at the very early stages, we realised that there was a need to coordinate things and communicate well with early years settings and schools. And so we, at the very beginning, we started an early years and school briefing that went daily to schools, and that now goes twice a week. But that's been crucial in making sure that we continue some of the work that was already started through Mind the Gap, particularly around these disadvantaged and special needs children and those who have been recognised at risk for child protection or safeguarding. So there have been regular updates on information that's coming from the government and locally. Public health have had a really key role in that and have provided some excellent support for early year settings that have helped us keep the work going. I think it was also important to recognise that we needed regular communication face-to-face with people during this period. So we've had weekly meetings with strategic early years people. So we've met with children's centres and with the early years and childcare sufficiency team, with public health early years leads. So that we can try and coordinate the work of the strategy group for the peer challenge alongside the work that's going on for COVID. So that's really sort of setting the context. We haven't taken our foot off the pedal with this. We've had meetings of the working party, and we've looked at the key recommendations from the report, and we've worked on an action plan to address those recommendations. So recommendation 1 is fundamental, and the working party have worked on starting the strategy, but we need to make sure that we get the strategic leadership and the governance of this work really in place. Some of the criticisms in the report around the Mind the Gap work that had been going on were that there wasn't sufficient urgency or pace around some of that work. And I think that came about because we didn't always have complete buy-in from all agencies and all services because of conflicting demands on time, and because we didn't have that real strategic ownership of the work at the time, then we didn't secure that buy-in from all services. So I think this is a real positive step now that Julie and Deb Harkins are going to be the joint strategic leads of this. And we're working towards a Children's Health and Wellbeing Board that will be holding this work and the work of the groups involved to account. So work started on that. The working party we've got is quite at an operational level. We have started work on trying to gather the information together to develop a pathway. We've tried to make sure that we're learning from good practice in other authorities. And we've made use of an offer from one of the peers who took part in the challenge, Adam Hindhoff, who's the early years lead in Cheshire East. We'd arranged to visit him, but obviously we've had to do that all remotely now, but we've had meetings with him. And Rachel Smith, the early years lead from Public Health, has met with him and with Ben to look at some of the work for some of the other recommendations. But we're trying to make sure we're learning from the best practice across the board in other authorities so that we can capitalise on learning that they've already put into place. The work so far has involved a range of services, but I have to say we haven't yet fully secured the support through midwifery, through speech and language therapy and CCG. And that's a piece of work that I think is crucial to this. We fundamentally need them on board. And so that will be sort of the next step, really, when we've got this strategic lead in place. We have also, this links closely then, I suppose, with recommendation 2 about determining the leadership for the breadth of early years. I lead the early years childcare and sufficiency team, but that basically is the team that looks at early years provision, so the provision for early education for 2-year-olds and 3-year-old funded places, and to make sure that we've got statutory duty of sufficient childcare across the borough. But we recognise through the Mind the Gap work that early years is much broader than that and does include pre-birth work with parents, prospective parents, making sure we've got a very clear parenting journey in place from pre-birth right through to starting school and beyond that. So at the moment there's development in place to get a project officer to lead this work as an interim piece of work. That's been through the vacancy authorisation stage and has been approved by DLT, and so is now going to the vacancy resourcing group. And hopefully we'll soon have somebody as an independent person to lead on this work. Yes, Chair.
Oh, sorry, I was waiting to Sheila.
Oh, sorry. So that will be a key role in driving this forward. And as an independent person, they will be able to take a real strategic lead on this and look at it objectively and take on board the recommendations from the report without any of the historical issues that are difficult for some parts of the service to recognise and to build on. So that works in hand, and as I say, since the presentation was written, we've now got that vacancy approved to proceed. The recommendation 3 was looking at the earlier strategy, and the operational group are proceeding with this whilst we're waiting for the strategic lead to be in place. So we're developing a pathway for early years, and where we've worked, as I say, with Cheshire East to look at their pathway. We're working with a couple of other authorities to learn from them. And once we can secure that buy-in from all agencies, that work I think will proceed at a greater pace, but work is already in hand with that. We've set up some task and finish groups to try and proceed that work at a real pace now. So public health are leading on a couple of those. One of those is to determine the outcomes that we need to be in place. Initially, this work started when we identified gaps at the end of early years, so the early years foundation stage profile. But actually, there are an awful lot of other outcome measures well before that that need to be informing our work. So there's going some task and finish group starting to look at that. And a key piece of work on that is data sharing. I think one of the comments that was presented to the challenge team when they were in is that we didn't have any sort of formal data sharing in place across services because it was too difficult, and that came to them from a number of different sources. It is something that the Mind the Gap group had looked at, and there were some barriers there to sharing some of the data, but other authorities have managed it. And it's really interesting that a piece of work we did right at the beginning of lockdown, we worked with Julia's team on the work that she described about trying to identify vulnerable children. We were really concerned they weren't being picked up when earlier settings closed. And we were able to get a data sharing agreement in place really quickly to address that piece of work. And I think that's broken down some of the barriers that we perhaps had locally. And then along with the learning from other authorities, we're able to now proceed that work. We'd already done quite a bit of work on determining the local definition of school readiness, and there's a task and finish group set up to continue that work and get that signed off so that that can inform the strategy as well. And we're also keen to develop that further so that we go beyond the school readiness definition and we work on a nursery readiness approach as well, which is going beyond what many other authorities have done, but we feel is really key to helping parents and all agencies really understand where our children need to be by the time they're starting nursery and starting school, and what's in place in Calderdale to support them and their families to get there. So I've touched on the information and data sharing protocol that's key recommendation 4. There's a task and finish group being set up through public health leading on that, and that's going to be key.
Leslie, can
yes,
I just pause you there a sec? I'm just aware of the time because it's gone 10 to 8 and it's scheduled 6 till 8. And I'm sorry to have to cut you short because the other items have gone on for so long, but I really want to make sure that the members get a chance to ask you the questions. I can see from the chat some people may have a couple of questions for you, and I don't want us to get to 8 o'clock and then draw a line under it and nobody have chance
Absolutely.
to do anything they want. Is that okay? So just want to make use of the time for members to get your expertise as well. So should we open it out? You've got the presentation, Councillor Rachel, you've got the areas of recommendations in detail. Should we move on to the questions that you may have for Leslie, particularly around kind of making sure that that we really do move on this? And you've touched on some of this already this evening about early years sufficiency, about closing the gap and how important the work is, but suggest we move on to questions.
Absolutely, yeah. Do you want me to take them from the chat, or Chair, shall I wait for you to
I think Councillor Raystrick might have just dropped out, but I think we've got a question from Councillor Hutchinson. So do you want to go first, Councillor Hutchinson?
Okay, thanks. I think there were a couple before me, but
I'm back.
I know that services, that contracts on the various services will all have different times to run, but I was it was made a couple of times in the report that there was too much focus in the contracts on outputs rather than outcomes. I don't see that in the action plan as something that you would be addressing. Have you got, do you feel that you've got the knowledge to, or of ways of drawing up those contracts, or the support to draw up those contracts so that they can be output based, and so that as they come up for renewal, that can more focus can occur? And the other aspect of focus is that there was also a criticism that the early years offer in Calderdale is strongly universal and not sufficiently targeted on vulnerable children. And again, I can't see anything in the action plan to show how that might be, universality might be rolled back in favour of the more vulnerable.
Leslie, I'll just cover this because I've had a one-to-one with Jill Holbert, who's our commissioning manager today, and we were talking about this very point. It is in there, Councillor Hutchinson, but it isn't explicit, but it's around the key performance indicators. And we have, as you know, the Children's Centre contract has been extended over the last few years, and the council has been very proud about the fact that it's protected it and made sure that we haven't made reductions and really eaten into that kind of early years offer in the way that other councils have had to with us, we're making budget reductions. And I think what's happened with the rollover of the contract is it has lost its teeth, and it is based on and it's there in the report really of saying, we've commissioned a fairly, standard offer that would have been fit for purpose 5, 6, 7 years ago, but not anymore. So it is in there about the refresh of the KPIs. They do have to do some basic, some basic universal offer, but we are really going to tighten up on that, and we have made changes to the contract already, and there's some quite tight oversight of the children's centres from commissioning and looking at the offer for the vulnerable as well during COVID. So it is in there. If you want me to get you a little brief from commissioning just around that whole area, I will, but I have spoken to Jill about this morning, and her and the team are on with it and feeding into Leslie's work.
That would be lovely just to fill out the picture. Thanks.
I can certainly provide. This isn't the action plan, Councillor Hutchinson. I think it's really important to stress that there's much more rigour and a robust action plan that sits behind this. This was just an update as to some of the key points that I was asked to present. But I can certainly share the action plan, because within that, outcomes is a fundamental part of it, rather than output. And part of that work of the task and finish group for data is to look at, for us to determine what those outcomes are, so that we can have a really clear plan and not rely on those just at the end of early years. We've got some really key measures already in place around 2-year-old health checks and things like that. So it's a case of identifying all those. So that works clearly in hand, and I can share that with you in more detail. Also, I think the bit about the action plan I will send on, and Julie's addressed those other parts about the universal offer, but that's again included in the action plan in much more detail.
I'm amazed that any department in CYP is not obsessed with outcomes. Sylvia.
Yes, thank you, Chair. You mentioned the lack of commitment so far from 3 of the other agencies. Why is that, and what can Calderdale do to persuade them to join in?
I think some of that is to do with the situation that we're in, that they are health services, and that there have clearly been some real pressures on a number of services, and that they've had to work in different ways. Certainly people like speech and language therapy, their service has been stretched in trying to provide the provision that children are needing, and that the service usually provides in very different ways. So I think pre-COVID we did have more buy-in from those services, and they certainly engaged in the peer challenge fully. So I am confident we can get that back, but I think we're victim of circumstances. And now that we've got the strategic leadership of Julie and Parkins in there, I'm sure that we will we'll have that in place really quickly. It is fundamental to the work.
Amanda.
Thank you, Chair. Gosh, we haven't really got much time left.
Meeting, sorry, Amanda. Well, the meeting didn't actually cut out at 2 hours, does it?
Okay. I was just getting a little bit stressed then. I have to talk really fast.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm aware that early years is looking at the bigger picture from pre-birth all the way through, which is fantastic. The work that I do with developmental movement is pre-birth all the way up to, well, all the way up to death actually with dementia, but we work a lot with preschool and look at developmental movement play. And so we use a model called Kestenberg movement profiling, where we measure the speed of people's movement, or the speed of children's movement, the direction, how they use space. Yeah, and it's a tried and tested model. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. I'm just sharing information. I'm wondering if, so you've linked up with Cheshire to learn from their best practice. I'm wondering also if you're looking at research with developmental movement professionals. I know there's pieces of research being done in Edge Hill University, in Derby. I mean, again, I can link you up with different places doing research. But yeah, so developmental movement is a way of actually measuring how stressed or how anxious or how or whether children are actually at the right developmental movement level without using words. It's a very simple system and it's been used for quite a long time. I'm pretty sure that other local authorities are using it, but I'm not sure if you guys are aware of it. But I'm certainly happy to have a chat and also signpost you if you don't know who those people are. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll certainly take you up on your offer to discuss that outside of this meeting further. But yes, we are certainly looking at evidence-based research across a number of areas, developmental movement being part of that, but a number of other areas as well that are really significant. And we're determined that it will be evidence-based research that will inform this work. So yes, I'd be happy to speak to you outside of this meeting and take you up on your expertise there. Thank you.
Okay, can anybody hear me?
You can now, thank you.
Yes.
Right, it must be too hot. I don't have anybody else waiting, I don't think. So I just have 1 or 2 points, then we can go. I'd like to echo Councillor Hutchinson's point. I'm amazed that sentences like not routinely child outcome focused appear in this report. I was also really surprised that we're not representing the child's voice. This is something we've been concentrating on for, I can't remember how long now, just amazing. So there's obviously a long way to go here. We don't have a strategy yet. And of course, if you don't know where you're going, any bus will do. But it looks like an interesting piece of work. And I think I think we'd probably like to have a look at it sometime in the future when we've got a bit more, less COVID affected stuff. Interesting also that one of the points is we weren't targeting it well enough. I think I've already made a target comment tonight already. If we were to concentrate on two things in this department, it should be targets and outcomes. If you'd like to add anything, Julie or Leslie, now's your chance.
Yeah, I'd welcome the opportunity to present in more detail, to look at the real detail of the plan and the actions that are being taken, and update you on the progress that's being made towards those, because, as I say, we are trying to make sure we progress it rapidly. Capacity is an issue, without a doubt, but the development of the leadership now, I think, will really assist in taking this forward, and having a dedicated independent project lead will really ensure that, that there's rigour to the actions and people are held to account for that.
Anything to add, Julie?
No, quite happy with bringing it back, Councillor Raystrick, when it's more developed. That'd be good with us.
All right, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
For this, are we staying or are we going? Are we going to call it a draw now? There was a work programme, as usual. Any suggestions? If there's no suggestions, Lauren and I'll sort it out.
Well, I did ask whether we could have include those, have a look at the audit outcomes from the safeguarding that were mentioned in the safeguarding report when they're available.
Noted, Lauren. I take it already. Yeah, we got that, Colin. Thanks.
Thanks.
Anything else? All right, members. Have a good evening. I'm sorry you've missed 3 football matches, but there's one starts at 8.
You too, Councillor Raystrick. Thank you very much, members.
Not my game either. All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.